The air inside the courtroom was thick with judgment. Eleazar Vaughn could feel it pressing down on him like an invisible weight. As he rolled himself forward, every pair of eyes in the room bore into him, not with curiosity, but with silent condemnation. He had been in a wheelchair since he was 19, the result of a car accident that had shattered more than just his spine. Now, at 34, he found himself in an even more inescapable prison, standing trial for a crime he didn't commit. Across the room, Judge Bertram Holloway sat reclined in his oversized leather chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his thin lips. He was a man who reveled in control, who had spent decades on the bench playing God with people's lives. And today, his latest target was a man who couldn't even stand before him. He tapped his gavel against the desk, more for theatrics than necessity, before leaning forward. His voice, dripping with condescension, cut through the courtroom. "Well, Mr. Vaughn, I see that in addition to allegedly defrauding an entire corporation, you also have difficulty standing before the law." A few muffled chuckles rippled through the spectators. Others merely shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the judge and the man in the wheelchair, unsure whether to cringe or pretend they hadn't heard the blatant insult. But Eleazar? He didn't flinch. He had spent his entire life facing men like Holloway, men who saw weakness where there was resilience, who mistook silence for submission. His attorney, Nolan Whitmore, a fresh-faced young lawyer barely 5 years out of law school, cleared his throat, visibly uneasy. "Your Honor, my client deserves respect." Holloway let out a sharp laugh, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Respect? Respect is for men who contribute to society, not for those who scam their way through it while hiding behind a chair." Eleazar exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the wheels of his chair. He had walked into this courtroom knowing what to expect: bias, cruelty, injustice. But what the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom had yet realized, was that Eleazar Vaughn had spent the last 15 years studying the law better than most men who sat on that bench. And before this trial was over, he would make damn sure they all knew it. The courtroom remained tense, the weight of Judge Holloway's words lingering in the air like the foul scent of arrogance. Eleazar Vaughn had seen injustice before. He had felt it in the way people looked past him, in the way doors shut before he even had the chance to knock. But today, the injustice had a face, and it was grinning at him from behind the judge's bench. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lazily against the desk. His amusement was evident, like a man toying with an opponent he had already defeated. "Mr. Vaughn, I imagine you believe you are some kind of misunderstood genius, a victim of the system, perhaps?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "People like you always do." Eleazar tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. He could have responded immediately, could have let the anger inside him take control. But that wasn't his style. No, Eleazar had learned long ago that true power didn't come from raising your voice, it came from knowing exactly when to use it. His attorney, Nolan Whitmore, was visibly rattled, his fingers clenching and unclenching as he fumbled through his notes. He was a decent lawyer, but green, too green to go up against a judge like Holloway. Eleazar had no doubt that the judge had already decided his fate long before he had even rolled into the courtroom. "Your Honor," Nolan said, clearing his throat, "my client is not asking for sympathy, nor is he trying to manipulate the system. He is here to prove his innocence, just like any other citizen is entitled to do." Holloway let out a long, exaggerated sigh. "Innocence. Now, that's an interesting word. And what exactly makes you believe, Mr. Vaughn, that you have any right to claim it?" Eleazar finally moved. He adjusted the sleeves of his suit, perfectly tailored, crisp, a sharp contrast to the image of helplessness Holloway seemed so desperate to project onto him. Then, he met the judge's gaze head-on. "The law, Your Honor. That's what gives me the right. And I know it better than most men in this room." A murmur spread through the courtroom. For the first time since the trial had begun, Holloway's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second. He had expected defiance, sure. He had expected a few rehearsed speeches about fairness and dignity. But he hadn't expected this calm, unwavering certainty. Eleazar could see it now, the slightest shift in the judge's demeanor. Holloway wasn't worried. Not yet. But he was intrigued. And that was all Eleazar needed. Because this wasn't just a battle for his freedom anymore. This was war. The weight of Eleazar's words still hung in the air, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Holloway's smirk had returned, but there was something different this time, something forced. The way his fingers clenched against the edge of the bench betrayed what his face tried to conceal. For the first time in years, Holloway was looking at a defendant who wasn't playing by his rules. Eleazar's mind was razor-sharp, carefully dissecting every move, every reaction. He had spent years studying men like Holloway, men who wielded power not for justice, but for control. Men who saw the courtroom as their personal stage, where they played both executioner and entertainer. But Holloway had underestimated him. "Oh," the judge finally said, arching a brow. "And what makes you think you know the law better than the rest of us, Mr. Vaughn? Because you read a few books in your spare time?" Eleazar exhaled slowly, suppressing a smirk of his own. He had expected this. Holloway was a performer, after all, and the courtroom was his theater. He needed an audience to maintain his power. "Not just a few books, Your Honor," Eleazar said smoothly. "Enough to know that bias from the bench is a direct violation of judicial ethics." A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Malcolm Hensley, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even Nolan, Eleazar's own attorney, looked slightly stunned at his client's boldness. Holloway's expression darkened, though he was quick to mask it. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, as if inspecting Eleazar under a microscope. "Bias? That's a heavy accusation, son." His voice was low now, slow, calculated. "Are you implying that this court is incapable of fairness?" Eleazar didn't blink. "I'm implying that fairness is not measured by a judge's amusement, Your Honor. And I'm certain the appellate courts would be very interested in your definition of it." The murmurs grew louder. Holloway's grip on the bench tightened, and for the first time, there was no humor in his eyes. The arrogance was still there, the condescension, but now it was laced with something else, something Eleazar had been waiting to see. Restraint. Holloway wanted to strike, to put Eleazar in his place with a sharp-tongued retort, but he couldn't, not without proving Eleazar's point. And that, Eleazar knew, was his first real victory. Because men like Holloway didn't fear defiance. They feared exposure. And Eleazar had just placed him under a spotlight. The courtroom had shifted. It was subtle, like the first breeze before a storm, but Eleazar felt it. The once unquestioned authority of Judge Holloway now had a hairline fracture, a crack so small that most people wouldn't notice, except Eleazar did. And he knew that cracks, no matter how insignificant they seemed at first, had the potential to shatter everything. Holloway exhaled through his nose, straightening in his seat. His eyes flickered across the courtroom, taking in the reaction of the jury, the attorneys, the spectators. His grip on control was slipping, and he knew it. "Mr. Vaughn," Holloway finally said, his voice measured, "I'd be careful throwing around accusations you can't substantiate. I have spent over 3 decades upholding the law in this courtroom. Do you truly believe someone sitting in that chair, can challenge me?" Eleazar tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. He could feel the stares pressing into him from all sides, the jury watching him with newfound curiosity, the prosecutor eyeing him warily, and his own lawyer, Nolan, gripping his pen so tightly it might snap. "I don't need to challenge you, Your Honor," Eleazar said smoothly. "The law already does." The air in the room thickened. Holloway's jaw tightened, but he forced a thin smile. "Since you're such an expert in the law, Mr. Vaughn, perhaps you can enlighten us." What legal grounds do you believe you have to question this court's impartiality? Eleazar leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He had spent the last 6 months preparing for this exact moment, knowing that it would come down to more than just arguing his innocence. It would come down to proving that this entire trial had been rigged against him from the start. "Glad you asked," he said, his tone almost casual. "Let's start with judicial misconduct." A murmur rippled through the spectators. The prosecutor, Malcolm Hensley, shot up from his chair. "Objection! This is outrageous." Overruled, Holloway snapped, his eyes never leaving Eleazar. "I want to hear this." Eleazar resisted the urge to smirk. "Of course you do." He tapped his fingers against the table, steady, deliberate. "Your Honor, let's talk about the Fifth Circuit ruling in Davis v. State. You're familiar with it, I assume?" A flicker of something unreadable passed over Holloway's face. "Go on." "That case established that a judge's prejudicial statements, whether intentional or not, could be grounds for a mistrial. Now, I'd hate to assume intent, but given the fact that you laughed in my face in front of a jury, I'd say that could be perceived as prejudicial, wouldn't you?" Silence. Holloway's fingers drummed once against the bench, and Eleazar could see the restraint in his posture. "You're reaching," the judge said. Eleazar shook his head. "No, Your Honor, I'm reading. Page 214, to be exact. Right where it states that a judge displaying open bias against a defendant constitutes a reversible error on appeal." A hushed gasp spread through the room. Even Nolan was now staring at Eleazar as if seeing him for the first time. Judge Holloway's face remained impassive, but Eleazar knew better. He knew when a man had been struck with a truth too sharp to ignore. The judge shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "That's an interesting interpretation," Holloway said, though his voice was noticeably lower. "But this is my courtroom, and I'll be the one to determine what is and isn't bias. Not you." Eleazar met his gaze head-on. "For now." Holloway's expression darkened. This was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was now a living thing, pulsing beneath the surface of every whispered conversation and darted glance. Judge Holloway had not expected to be challenged, certainly not by a man in a wheelchair, a defendant he had dismissed as weak, as someone he could mock without consequence. But Eleazar Vaughn had forced his hand. For the first time in years, Holloway felt his own authority wavering. He exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of his bench as he stared down at Eleazar. "You think you're clever, don't you, Mr. Vaughn?" Holloway said, his voice measured, but laced with something deeper, something dangerous. Eleazar met his gaze without flinching. "I don't think, Your Honor." "I know." A low murmur rippled through the room. Even Malcolm Hensley, the prosecutor, seemed momentarily stunned into silence. No defendant had ever spoken to Holloway like this, not in all his years on the bench. Holloway let out a slow, humorless chuckle, shaking his head as if amused. But his fingers still gripped the wood a little too tightly. "Well, Mr. Vaughn," he said, leaning forward, "since you're such a scholar of the law, tell me, what exactly do you hope to gain from this little performance? Do you think you can undermine my authority? Do you think you'll walk out of here a free man just because you know how to quote case law?" Eleazar exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. "I don't need to undermine your authority, Judge. I just need to expose the truth. And I think I already have." Silence. A flicker of something passed over Holloway's face, gone in an instant, but Eleazar caught it. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was fear. It lasted less than a second before Holloway masked it, straightening in his seat. But Eleazar had seen it. And that meant one thing. Holloway knew he was right. Eleazar's fingers tapped against the table, slow and deliberate. "The truth is inconvenient, isn't it?" he said. "Especially when it threatens to unravel everything. Holloway's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond. Eleazar took his silence as confirmation. "Let's talk about your relationship with the prosecutor, shall we?" A ripple of gasps filled the room. Hensley shot up from his seat. "Objection!" he barked, his face red. "This is irrelevant and inflammatory." "Overruled," Holloway snapped, but his voice was tight. "Mr. Vaughn, you'd better tread carefully." Eleazar gave a slow, knowing nod. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't want to say anything that might incriminate someone." The entire room had shifted now. Eleazar could feel it. "You see, I've spent the last few months doing my own research, and I found something interesting. Something about a certain judge and a certain prosecutor working together on multiple cases." Holloway's jaw tensed. "What exactly are you implying?" Eleazar leaned forward. "That you and Hensley have been fixing cases for years." The courtroom erupted. Judge Holloway slammed his gavel down with force, his face flushed with fury. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" But the damage was done. People were whispering, glancing at each other, their faces filled with uncertainty. For the first time, Judge Holloway wasn't the one in control. And Eleazar Vaughn? He wasn't done yet. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it was a battlefield. The revelation that Judge Holloway and Prosecutor Hensley had potentially been fixing cases sent a ripple of shock and suspicion through the air. Eleazar sat motionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him, watching the chaos unfold. Holloway's gavel thundered against the wood. "Silence! I will not have this courtroom descend into madness." But the judge's authority had already begun to crumble. The audience, the bailiffs, even the clerks, everyone had seen his reaction. He was rattled, caught off guard in a way that no defendant had ever managed before. Eleazar took a slow breath, scanning the faces around him. He knew he had to be careful. He had cracked the surface, but if he pushed too hard, too fast, Holloway would find a way to crush him. Hensley was the first to regain his composure. The prosecutor shot Holloway a warning glance before turning back to Eleazar, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is absurd. You're a desperate man, Mr. Vaughn, trying to divert attention from your own case by fabricating conspiracy theories." Eleazar raised an eyebrow. "Is that what I'm doing?" He reached into the folder in front of him and slid out a single sheet of paper. "Funny, because this document here, filed under the state's own judicial archives, shows something interesting. It seems that in the last 5 years, you and Judge Holloway have ruled against defendants with public defenders in nearly 98% of your cases. But when a private attorney was involved, that conviction rate dropped to just 64%. A hush fell over the room. Even Holloway's fingers curled slightly on his bench, as if resisting the urge to reach for something. His gavel, his authority, his control. Hensley scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Statistics prove nothing. There are always external factors." "Of course," Eleazar said smoothly. "And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that a significant number of those private attorneys were from firms that have contributed heavily to your campaign funds, right?" Hensley's nostrils flared. "Objection!" he barked. Overruled, Holloway snapped automatically, then froze, realizing what he had just done. The mistake was small, almost imperceptible, but it did not go unnoticed. A judge should not be ruling on an objection in a case that now implicated himself. But Holloway had done it instinctively, out of habit, out of fear. Eleazar smirked. "That was interesting." Holloway straightened. "Enough of this nonsense. I will not allow my courtroom to be turned into a circus." "Oh, I agree, Your Honor. But that's not up to you anymore." The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. One of the court clerks, Miriam Dorsey, a woman who had worked under Holloway for over a decade, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. For the first time, Eleazar noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the paperwork in front of her. She knew. The weight of everything she had seen, everything she had signed off on, it was written all over her face. Eleazar turned his gaze back to Holloway. "How long do you think you can keep this buried?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pitying. "Secrets have a way of coming to the surface, Judge. And I think we're just getting started." Holloway's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. The power in the room had shifted, and Eleazar Vaughn was holding the scales. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Every set of eyes flickered between Judge Holloway, whose fingers were curled so tightly around his gavel that they trembled, and Eleazar, whose steady, measured breaths betrayed no sign of fear. But beneath the surface, Eleazar's mind was racing. He could see it, the hesitation in Holloway's eyes, the way the prosecutor's arguments were starting to sound rehearsed, desperate even. They were trying to keep control, but control was slipping away like sand through their fingers. The balance of power in that room was shifting, and everyone could feel it. Prosecutor Hensley cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he paced in front of the jury. His voice carried the same confidence it always had, but this time there was an edge of uncertainty underneath it. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be swayed by baseless distractions. The defense wants you to believe that there is some grand conspiracy at play. But let's focus on what truly matters, the overwhelming evidence that points to the guilt of Mr. Vaughn. Theatrics have no place in this courtroom." His words were sharp, but they landed flat. The jury wasn't as convinced as they had been before. A few of them even looked uncertain. Eleazar let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but piercing. "Theatrics? That's interesting coming from the prosecution, considering how much effort has been put into pretending this trial is fair. But let's talk about facts, shall we? Like the fact that key pieces of evidence were conveniently lost, or that witness statements were altered. Tell me, Mr. Hensley, does integrity only matter when it benefits the people in power?" His words rippled through the courtroom, causing murmurs among those watching. Judge Holloway's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he didn't interrupt. The prosecutor forced a smile, though the frustration in his eyes was impossible to miss. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is making baseless accusations." Judge Holloway hesitated. That single moment of hesitation said everything. It was the first real crack in the armor, and Eleazar saw it. The silence stretched for just a second too long before the judge finally said, "Sustained. Mr. Vaughn, watch your tone." But his voice lacked the force it once had. Across the room, Court Clerk Miriam Dorsey had been shifting uncomfortably in her seat. She had seen and heard too much over the years, always choosing silence. But now, as she looked at Eleazar, something in her expression changed. It was as if she had reached a decision, an internal battle finally won. Slowly, deliberately, she stood from her chair. Her voice, though quiet at first, cut through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor, I have something I need to submit into the record." The entire courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Judge Holloway's eyes locked onto hers, his face pale. Eleazar didn't move, didn't breathe. He just watched. Because in that moment, he knew everything was about to change. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, a suffocating mix of anticipation and judgment. Anthony Carter sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his hands clasped together so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Across the room, the jury members shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between him and the prosecutor, Daniel Whitmore, who exuded an air of smug confidence. Anthony had spent weeks preparing for this moment, yet as the trial reached its most critical juncture, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. He had always believed that truth was his greatest weapon, but what if, in this courtroom, truth alone wasn't enough? Julia Reynolds, Anthony's defense attorney, tapped her pen against the desk in a rhythmic pattern, a silent message telling him to stay calm. But calm was impossible. Whitmore was pacing now, holding up a stack of documents like they were the irrefutable proof of Anthony's guilt. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice smooth yet cutting, "you continue to claim ignorance regarding the funds deposited into your account. And yet," he stepped closer, lifting one of the papers for dramatic effect, "these bank records suggest otherwise. These transactions bear your signature. Would you like to reconsider your statement?" Anthony exhaled slowly, forcing himself to meet Whitmore's gaze. "I never made those transactions," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Someone else did. I was framed." His words hung in the air, but instead of consideration, they were met with a scoff from the prosecution's side. A few jurors exchanged glances, some skeptical, others unreadable. Whitmore smirked, shaking his head as he turned to address them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitmore said, spreading his arms wide as if addressing a classroom of students, "how many times have we heard this story? I was framed. It wasn't me. It's the oldest trick in the book." He paused, letting his words sink in, then leaned on the witness stand, his expression softening into one of mock sympathy. "Mr. Carter, if you expect this jury to believe that someone orchestrated an elaborate scheme just to set you up, you're going to need more than empty words." Julia shot to her feet, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is leading the jury with baseless assumptions and attacking my client's character." The judge, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, let out a tired sigh before nodding. "Sustained. Mr. Whitmore, stay within the facts." But the damage was already done. Anthony could see it in the way some jurors looked at him, uncertainty creeping into their expressions, doubt solidifying where there once might have been fairness. Just as the weight of it all threatened to crush him, the heavy doors of the courtroom creaked open. The sound drew every eye toward the entrance as a woman stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Anthony felt the air leave his lungs. His pulse roared in his ears. It was Evelyn Carter, his estranged sister. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The courtroom, once alive with murmurs and the rustling of papers, now held its breath. Evelyn Carter walked forward with measured steps, her expression unreadable. Anthony hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years, not since their last bitter argument, where she had accused him of choosing ambition over family. Yet here she was, stepping into the heart of a trial that could determine the rest of his life. His heart pounded like a war drum. Was she here to help him, or to bury him? Julia's eyes flickered with recognition, and she immediately whispered something to Anthony, but he barely heard her. Evelyn reached the witness stand and straightened her posture before addressing the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I have information that could change the course of this trial." A ripple of shock passed through the courtroom, the jury shifting in their seats as whispers erupted. Whitmore, ever composed, merely raised an eyebrow, but Anthony saw the brief flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes. The judge adjusted his glasses, his gaze sharp. "Ms. Carter, you are not on the witness list. If you have new evidence, it should have been submitted through proper channels." "I understand, Your Honor," she replied, glancing momentarily at Anthony before continuing. "But what I have can't wait. If you allow me to testify, I can provide proof that my brother was framed." The words hit Anthony like a freight train. He had spent weeks drowning in doubt, questioning if he could ever prove his innocence. And now, in the 11th hour, his own sister had come forward with the very thing he needed. Whitmore, unwilling to lose control of the narrative, immediately stood. "Your Honor, I strongly object. This is a last-minute stunt to derail the prosecution's case." The defense had ample time to submit witnesses, and suddenly, a surprise testimony appears? It's highly irregular. Julia was already on her feet, countering with equal force. Your Honor, if Ms. Carter has evidence that directly impacts my client's guilt or innocence, it would be a violation of justice to silence her. The prosecution claims to seek the truth, so let's hear it. The judge's eyes moved between the two attorneys before finally settling on Evelyn. A long silence stretched through the room. Then, with a tired sigh, he nodded. I'll allow it. Ms. Carter, you may take the stand. Anthony exhaled sharply, his pulse a mix of relief and apprehension. Evelyn walked past him without so much as a glance, but something in her demeanor told him that this wasn't easy for her either. As she was sworn in, the room seemed to shrink, every person present leaning in, eager to hear what she had to say. She adjusted the microphone in front of her, took a steadying breath, and then spoke. I know who really made those transactions. And I have the proof to back it up. The entire courtroom erupted into chaos. The courtroom was in uproar. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, but the revelation had set off a storm no one could ignore. Anthony's hands clenched the arms of his chair as he stared at his sister, his mind racing. Could this really be it? The turning point he had been desperate for? When silence finally settled over the room, Evelyn locked eyes with the judge. I have financial records, she said, her voice steady. Bank transfers. Encrypted emails. All leading back to one man. She turned her gaze toward the prosecution's table. Gregory Whitmore. A stunned hush fell over the room. The prosecutor, who had spent weeks painting Anthony as a criminal, stiffened, his confident mask cracking for the first time. He forced a scoff. This is absurd. Your Honor, this is nothing but a desperate attempt to distract from the case at hand. Evelyn didn't flinch. Then let's talk about this. She pulled out a USB drive from her coat pocket and handed it to Julia. On this drive are transaction logs proving that someone within Whitmore's office orchestrated the entire scheme. They needed a scapegoat, someone high enough in the company to take the fall, but not powerful enough to fight back. My brother fit the profile perfectly. Anthony felt his breath catch. His heart pounded against his ribs as Julia plugged the drive into her laptop. She scrolled through the files quickly, her eyes widening with each passing second. Then she looked up, turning the screen toward the judge. Your Honor, these emails are time-stamped. They show clear instructions given to falsify reports and reroute funds. And the orders came from Mr. Whitmore himself. A murmur spread through the jurors. Whitmore's expression hardened. This is ridiculous. Where did you even get this information? Evelyn met his glare head-on. From someone inside your office. Someone who got tired of covering up your messes. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he scrolled through the evidence. After a long moment, he exhaled. Mr. Whitmore, these are serious allegations. Given the nature of this information, I am ordering an immediate suspension of the proceedings while we conduct an investigation. Whitmore stood abruptly. This is a farce. This trial was never about the truth. It was about taking me down. But no one was listening. The judge had already given orders for an independent review, and Julia took Anthony's arm, squeezing it tightly. This is it, she whispered. We've got him. As officers approached Whitmore, he finally realized he had lost. With a defeated scowl, he turned to Anthony. You think this clears you? The system doesn't forget. Anthony met his gaze with unwavering resolve. Neither do I. Minutes later, the judge declared a mistrial based on the new evidence. The weight that had pressed against Anthony's chest for months finally lifted. He was free. As he stepped out of the courthouse into the sunlight, Evelyn stood beside him. They hadn't spoken beyond the trial, but now words weren't needed. For the first time in years, they understood each other. And as the city buzzed around them, Anthony knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.